This evening your irrigation questions are due, so please do not neglect to do that. Okay, we got just taking some roll here.
That's gonna take so long.
I know. No, I just. I got the first part. I just.
Are there any questions at this point on your papers?
Well, and it was like, his reasoning was, oh, well, Marcia corrected us, and he's like, and, you don't know what you're doing, so, I was like, I gotta just, come on.
Okay, so we're just gonna go look and see.
Yeah.
Take a quick.
Shoot. You know,
Grab the
for our
viewer.
hood. Well, shoot. But probably harder. Yeah.
Sorry, it's taking just a sec to load this PowerPoint presentation. Yeah, you're doing the booth after this.
No, well, there's different time slots, so.
Me and Lucas were going to do it from 11 as well.
Oh, good. So, at least someone.
We got it. Trust me. I don't really want to put my phone in there.
All right, prior to the test, we had this equation. The equation for photosynthesis, and we said that everything that farmers do in the field is for the management of that right there. Okay? What is the name that we have for this carbon, hydrogen, oxygen molecule? carbohydrate. Okay, that's one of the words that we use for that. Anything with carbon, hydrogen, oxygen is a carbohydrate. Okay. This is going to go to form sugars in the plant. We'll see some other things that it's going to form in a bit. Sugars in the plant, which can form starches, which can be stored by things like tubers, or can be stored in seeds of plants as well. So that's what we need to understand about photosynthesis. As we move along in photosynthesis, we need to sort of zoom in into the processes, and this is where we sort of get into metabolism, the processes that are happening in the cell. All right, so here we have a typical cell that is in something like a palisade mesophyll cell. You know where that is in the plant cutaway that we had. Okay. So photosynthesis takes place not in all the cells, not in the cell walls, not in the nucleus, not in the mitochondria. They take place in these things called the chloroplasts. So here you can see the four chloroplasts that are in here. And in those chloroplasts, there are chlorophyll cells in those chloroplasts, 200 per cell. Okay? And those are stacked like coins. Think of just a stack of coins. That's what we're looking at right there. Those mesophyll cells. There's a lot of them, okay? And those are the sites. Those are actually the solar energy gain sites that we're really, really concerned about. Inside those chloroplast cells are these pigments, chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B. Really creative names there. And these pigments absorb light. Now remember that light comes into the atmosphere in a huge spectrum. And we have gamma rays and X-rays and radio waves and microwaves. And we have a visible light spectrum that's just a small sliver of all the spectrum of solar radiation that comes into the surface of the Earth, right? So it's not just all visible light that hits the surface of the Earth. So in that visible spectrum that our eyes are tuned to be able to see, you have from violet all the way over to pretty dark red. And that's the visible light spectrum. But what we have here is that inside of these chloroplasts, these green stacks of coin-like organs, you have the ability of those solar energy gaining mechanisms to absorb certain wavelengths of light. So we measure these wavelengths, the length of the wave from a trough to a trough, or from a depression to a depression. Sorry, peak to peak or trough to trough. Okay, that's we measure in nanometers. That's the thing that we're measuring. Kind of geeky physics, weird thing. Okay, but you do need to know that there is such a thing as light, and it comes to us in waves. And the wavelength is what we measure. And if we have something on the 400 end, if we have something on this end, we're kind of over here in that color, that violet color. If we have something on the 700 end, we're over here in the red color. Okay? But the cool thing is that chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B they don't absorb all the color. They only absorb, not only, they absorb more light in this violet and blue sector and in this red-orange sector. That's the really important light for them to do photosynthesis. And consequently, that's why plants are green. Okay? Plants are green because the light in this area, green and yellow, right? Sometimes they turn yellow if they have less nitrogen than they should. They reflect this area here because they're not absorbing it. Right? They're not actually taking in that light. And so it gets reflected, most of it gets reflected back off, so your eyes are seeing what's reflected, right? Chaz's hat is not red. You're seeing the red that's reflected. Everything else is absorbed. The red gets reflected off, so it looks red to your eye. Okay? That's how our eyes function. So this is the range of light that becomes important to plant life in the United States, or in the United States, that's funny, on the surface of the Earth, 400 to 700 nanometers. It can go a little beyond this. If you look at other textbooks or you take another botany class, you'll see it get maybe even more precise than that range. We're just going to leave it at that range right now. Okay? So Not all of the organs inside a particular cell. Remember, our palisade mesophyll and spongy mesophyll cells are made up of tons of these kinds of cells, all of which have chloroplasts in them that are absorbing light. Now, not all plants that we care about absorb light in the same way. So we need to get a little bit farther into that. That chlorophyll that's inside those chloroplast cells takes those photons of light and use that photon, and they turn it into chemical energy by means of the photosynthetic process. Interestingly, it only uses about 1 to 2% of the total light that hits the surface of a plant. Total light. Okay? So if a plant has access to 100% of the light that it has access to in any given day, it's only going to use 1 or 2% of that light to actually do the photosynthetic creations. So that's a really interesting a question as to what if we had better photosynthetic efficiency? What if we could use 10%? How would that function? So in crop agriculture, but in the whole plant world, we look at photosynthesis in a plant. We get really geeky about what happens in photosynthesis in a plant. You don't need to memorize this. Okay, this is for later on in your career when you take a botany class or some other higher course. But you do need to know it's complex. It's not just sunlight hits the chloroplasts and the chlorophyll and magic just happens. We're pretty precise about what happens, although, like I said the other day, there's some things that are a little bit of a black box when it comes to understanding photosynthesis. The first kind of photosynthesis, so we've said photosynthesis, and now we're going to say there's kinds of photosynthesis. The first kind of photosynthesis is called C3, okay? Carbon-3 photosynthesis. And we'll give you some nerdy stuff here. C3 plants use light reactions, so things that happen in the light, and other things that happen only in dark to form that sucrose, that carbohydrate molecule that you saw. So it's not just happening during the daytime. There's other things happening at night that are also causing these reactions to move forward and for us to get the product that we want. Light reactions absorb light energy and split water apart. That's cool. And two energy compounds produced are ATP, adenosine triphosphate, and NADPH. And so I want you to be exposed to having just seen these. You may have seen them in a high school biology class or something like that, and we're just kind of refreshing that here. Dark reactions. So here's our sort of our light reactions, and here's our dark reactions that they themselves have things going on. Fixed carbon from CO2. This is why we need plants to take in CO2, not necessarily for these light reactions, but when it gets to the dark reaction and we have some energy to put into this, that's when we can actually begin to fix that carbon. We can break down that carbon into this, for these plants, into the C3, and then we can create glucose from that, and from that we can go to create starch and sucrose. And who cares about that? Well, you do, because you like to take some apples that are sweet. Fructose. So this process, again, is totally applicable to what you, because this is yield, right? That's the whole reason why we started with you care about photosynthesis, because that thing right there becomes what fills your grain, which fills your belly or your livestock's belly. Okay? So dark reactions are responsible for taking that CO2 and creating the carbon compound that we want, those sugars that we want in those carbon compounds. C3 plants are the majority of the world's plants, and we're going to add from a temperate region, So here you can see these temperate, kind of in green, the temperate regions in green here, and not the tropical regions, but the temperate regions of the Earth. The world's plants are a majority in those areas are C3 plants. And C3 plants have some interesting things going on. Here's some typical C3 plants. We'll see another list of these here in a second. Alfalfa, wheat, soybean, cotton, tobacco, peanut. These are C3 plants. And in general, C3 plants tend to be cool weather plants. Tend to. Now, if there's some on that list, and you'll see some later, that aren't necessarily grown all in cool weather. Okay. But we're just going to say in general, that C3, this C3 mechanism during photosynthesis and after that light reaction into the dark reaction, does really well when it's a little bit cooler. Okay. As it gets hotter and hotter, C3 plants, they don't do as well. They're not as efficient in production of photosynthetic products. So inefficient in warm tropical climates, and when the CO2 levels in the leaf are low. So these plants really have to breathe in a lot of CO2 in order to do the processes that they want to do. Okay? So think about these plants as deep breathers. They have to have their stomata open as much as they can because they need to breathe really, really deep. A lot of CO2. Their CO2 in their leaf has to be really, really high. Okay? So that it's inefficient when those CO2 levels are low. So if drought's occurring and it has to close its stomata or partially close its stomata to keep that water from leaving, these plants are really sad. Okay? They're really sad. They don't want to be in that situation. When they're in that situation, they go through something called photorespiration, and that's a bad thing for the plants. It's basically like if you're a Snickers manufacturer and you have a big long Snickers manufacturing line. It'd be like spending all those man hours manufacturing Snickers, and they're going down the line, and the very last thing is to wrap those Snickers up in the thing, and then you've got 5,000 people down there, and you're just handing them out, and they're just eating them. And they don't ever get packaged and sent off. You don't ever make any money. They're just getting consumed. As soon as they come off the line, they're getting consumed. That's what photorespiration is. You make the product, and all of a sudden, boom, it's got to turn around and use that energy. Okay? So it's not a good situation for a plant to be in, because if I've got those people who are eating it, yeah, they're getting full, and you know, this is functioning and that's functioning, but you're not ever going to make any money. Okay? You're not going to put any money in the bank, i.e. you're not going to get any starch or any carbohydrate creation. Okay? So it uses a significant portion of the carbon energy fixed during photosynthesis right after photosynthesis, so it's not a good thing. As with all things in plants, as soon as we say, okay, this is the way a thing is, know that we have variations, right? We have ways that are different. So here's our different way. So we have C3 photosynthesis, sort of think cool weather, and think a lot of our crops are C3, okay, in temperate regions. Now we're going to move on to C4. Okay? C4. Plants adapted to tropical environments, so a little warmer weather, higher temperatures, drought prone possibly, high light intensity ecosystem. So you realize that sometimes light on the surface of the earth can be more intense, right? I was originally from Oklahoma, and in Oklahoma we have hot weather, but the sun isn't very intense. And when I moved here, and I moved up in elevation to 5,000 feet or whatever, 4,800 feet, like, I can feel the difference on my skin in the summer because I'm closer to the sun. It's more intense here. Light is more intense here because I'm closer to the sun. So on the surface of the earth, light intensity can and does change. Okay? So C4 can live under a little bit higher light intensity, okay? Because they have alternative systems to fix carbon. Okay? Remember, plants are breathing in carbon, and in that breathing in carbon, they either breathe it in and begin to immediately use it, or, like we have in C4 photosynthesis, they fix carbon dioxide as this thing called malate and aspartate. And these are 4 carbon compounds. So it breathes in this CO2, and then it fixes it in a form that it can stick it in a storage room. And then it can close its stomata and survive drought situations, and go in the storage room and grab that form and come out and be doing photosynthesis. So instead of being a deep breather, having to have its stomata open all the time, being a really deep breather of carbon dioxide, it can breathe some carbon dioxide, put it in a box, stick it away, close its stomata, bring that carbon dioxide back out, and begin to use it. So it doesn't have to always be breathing in that carbon dioxide and creating those photosynthetic products. So those compounds are used in a thing called the Calvin cycle, and that is what generates that glucose. It generates that glucose that we're looking at down here. Okay? So yes, it can do the same sort of C3 intake and creation as C3 plant did do, but it also makes another step of creating the C4 compound in malate, and that malate can hang around, and it can go into the Calvin cycle and create awesome stuff. There's the stuff we want in order to create yield. Okay. Only about 10% of plants are C4 plants. Corn, sorghum. This one here is called grain amaranth. Does it look like any weed we may have studied in this class? Looks like pigweed, doesn't it? Because it is. It is pigweed. But it's a different breed of pigweed, and we can actually harvest a grain out of the seed head. If you've ever seen pigweed, and you should do this when you see pigweed this coming summer, you should grab a pigweed head and that looks something like this, or is toward the end of its life cycle, and just kind of rub it and look at the seed, a little bitty black seeds. And even with weed seeds, you'll have starch that are in those weed seeds, because weed seeds have to do what regular seeds have to do. They have to have an energy source for the living seed that's inside there, right? So they still have starch energy, and grain amaranth is one that we actually use in the world. Okay. So this is a list of some of the C4 crops that we are used to. These two are the big ones. This one we've seen before. These are C4s that are native grasses. Not really important in terms of crop production, in terms of grain production, right? But we know they're important for other reasons. So here's a bit of a summary, okay? Major differences between C3 and C4 plants. This comes from your book. And we see the first thing, leaf anatomy. So C3 plants, remember that bundle sheath? Remember that vein? Okay, where we have the xylem and the phloem? Around that vein, we can have what's called a bundle sheath. And the picture had that bundle sheath. So in C3 plants, there is a bundle sheath, but that bundle sheath, those cells around that vein, they don't have chloroplasts. Okay? They don't have photosynthetic cells in them. In C4 plants, and this is really the awesome sauce of C4 plants, they actually have a well-organized bundle sheath. We'll show you a little sort of cartoonized version of this here in a second. Rich in chloroplasts, a bunch of chloroplasts around that vein. Now, that might not seem like a big deal to you right now, but what it allows us to see, that's the area where C4 does its magic of fixing carbon in a form that it can use later. And the whole use later concept is that it can close its stomata and not lose water, so it can be drought resistant. This one you don't have to know. Transpiration, again, we've talked about it, and the time that I put it in the notes, I probably should put it in earlier in the notes because we've talked about it so much, but we'll get to it here in a second. Transpiration ratio, that's kilograms of water per day per kilogram of dry matter produced. So how much water does it take to produce the same amount in, and this is in terms of kilograms, how many kilograms of water does the plant have to take up in order to produce a kilogram of dry matter? Pay attention to that dry matter. We're not talking about fresh, wet material, we're talking about dry material. And you see that C3 plants need a lot of water, right? 450 to 950, depending on the plant. This is really wide because it depends on the plant. Kilograms of water per kilogram of dry matter. Okay. Versus C3 plants, a lot less. Again, why? Well, because they can close their stomata and they don't have to worry. They can breathe a little bit of CO2 in, close their stomata, and they don't have to worry because they can keep doing the photosynthesis that they want to do. Photorespiration usually is only for C3 plants. C4 plants don't usually go through that. That's a wasteful process. Optimum temperature we see is 15 to 25 degrees C. Here, much warmer. C4 plants can live at much warmer environments, much warmer optimum temperatures. And then this thing, minimum ppm. What's ppm mean? Part per million. Okay, that concentration that I believe we've talked about before. And you can think about parts per million. I mean, this isn't really a percentage, but you can think of a percent is just a concentration, right? So parts per million. So for every million molecules of air, it needs 30 to 70 parts per million of carbon dioxide. So you can see that C3 plants are higher than C4 plants. So that deep breathing that C3 plants have to do, they have to open up their stomata, to breathe in a lot of CO2. They always have to be breathing in CO2 if they want to do photosynthesis. C4 plants, if C3 plants are deep breathers, C4 plants are sippers. Just a little, they're like whales. Come to the surface, okay, go back and dive for another 30 minutes. Come to the surface, okay, good, go back and dive for 30 minutes, right? C3 plants are like humans, like you can't be under for like more than 2 minutes, right? Okay. So this is the idea here And again, this thing is not important by itself. It's important because it's related to stomata opening and closing. Right? Stomata opening and closing is, for these plants, in this particular way, stomata opening and closing relates to how much CO2 do I need to take in, and how much water do I need to not lose. Okay? Table 1, the photosynthetic pathway of the 12 most valuable crops in the world. Okay? Crop rank is based on production values in US dollars, according to the United Nations Food and Ag Organization. This should look familiar to you. FAO Stat should look familiar to you. We've been on that website. Great website in terms of all kinds of crop information around the world. Okay? So you can see that C3 crops in general are really doing the bulk of the production in terms of value, in terms of US dollar value. Okay? So here's 1 is rice, 2 is wheat, 3 is soybeans. We'll go over here for number 4, maize. Number 5 is potatoes. Over here, number 6, sugarcane. Cotton's number 7, tomatoes, and so on. Okay? So most of them are in this C3 category. Now C3 for us has to mean you have to have enough water. You have to have enough water in order to help these to produce what they need to produce. So if we're looking at saving water, if we're having water constraints, well, guess what? These are the water users, and these don't use so much water. Over here, if you take out those 12 from the most valuable crops and all the lists that, all the crops that are produced in a major way, you take out those 12, then what does it look like? Okay, you still see that it's heavily weighted towards the C3 crops. You have some C4 crops, but almost all of these, so these right here, these are all relatives of corn. Okay, so sorghum, and you have a bunch of millets. Teff is kind of an ancient grain. Amaranth we saw. Fonio, never heard of it. Digitaria, Aecl, don't even know. Somebody should do their project on Fonio. You could Fonio it in. They do make a little desktop drum kit. I'm just like dying to get it. It's like okay, so that brings us to the question. So those were in terms of dollars. Here now what we're turning to is in terms of production. Okay? So now we're outlining the C4 plants with the green, C3 crops with the blue, right? So now you see in terms of production, so annual production of metric tons. How many metric tons of product are we getting from the field? Now you see that corn and sugarcane have risen to the top. The most biomass from the field. So these are really big producers in terms of biomass. Okay, so the market's not so right to make these the most valuable. That's cool, but now we're just looking at production. Okay, now we see that the C4 plants are out producing all the C3 plants. This should look familiar to you, right? These should look familiar. This one more than that one. So this is the cutaway of a plant leaf. You can see the stoma. You can see the bundle sheath. So both of them have a bundle sheath, but this bundle sheath doesn't have any photosynthetic capacity. You see those mesophyll cells that we studied earlier. There's our vein. Okay, so a simplified version of what we saw earlier. And then you look at the C4, and all of a sudden you see this green ring around the bundle sheath. And that green ring means this. That's what the green ring means. Higher production. Higher production. Okay? That's cool. If we picked out something like rice, okay? So here we're going to take a look at rice and say, well, rice is awesome. Is it possible to get a higher yield out of rice? Is that a possibility? Well, here's some statistics about rice. And just FYI, all this stuff is coming from this little study that was done here, exploiting the engine of C4 photosynthesis. If we can genetically modify a plant to resist Roundup, the next question is, can we breed or genetically modify a rice plant to do C4 photosynthesis? Is that possible? Do we want that? Would that help us at all? Rice provides 19% of the global dietary energy. That's huge. For a single crop to provide that much of the globe's intake of energy, that's a lot. I mean, 19 doesn't, but when you think about the world, 19% of the energy that goes into the world's mouths is rice. All of a sudden, rice becomes of utmost importance. 1990 was the last year that average rice yields increased in California. 1990 was the last year that rice yields increased in California. 33% is the percentage of rice production regions where yields have plateaued. Yeah, plateaued. Okay. So think about the yield, the production graphs that we've seen so far. Okay. So we've got yield here, we've got year here. For rice production to plateau, it looks something like this. Like we're not getting that sort of return. So if you looked at the sort of return that you would get here, it would be huge. For every increment here, for every increment you move here, for every year you move, you get a pretty significant increase. Over here, this rate of return over here is sucky. That's a technical term. For you move a year and nothing happens. Okay? Nothing happens. So I'm telling you right now, I was reading this other book. It's called Future Table or something like that. It's like, I can't remember what the name of it is. But anyway, I was reading it because I'm thinking about making agri-college students read it because it's such a neat concept. This husband and wife in California. The husband is in charge of the organic production program for the University of California in Davis, which is like top-notch ag school. The wife does genetic modification of rice. And so the book is about how do genetic modification and organic agriculture fit together? Can they fit together? Anyway, first thing that they say is world population is rising, and if we don't produce more, we're all going to die. Okay. Same argument here. Okay. Projected shortfall in rice production in millions of tons in 2050. If we go the rate we're going, we're all going to die, and we're going to need more rice produced. Okay. Now, yeah, we're going to need rice produced, right? We're going to have to produce rice, more rice. If we have more people, we're going to have to produce more rice. That's not like rocket science. Anybody who freaks out over not having enough production, I swear they have never driven across the United States, and they don't know what they're talking about because there's a lot of freaking land available if we had more people. We just need more people, right? We just need more people on Earth to work all the land so we can have more food. But anyway, beside the point, of course, we're going to need more. If we keep growing, we're going to need more rice. They're projecting a shortfall here in millions of tons, of 394 million tons of rice that we need to produce in the future. Over here we have, and so again, the question is, C4 is awesome. C4 lets us produce more with less resources, less water, less carbon dioxide intake, more drought situations can be grown in. A unit of water goes further with C4 crops, producing far more food. In China, planting C4 rice could feed 50% more people per hectare. 50% more people if we had C4 rice, based on what we know about the production levels and the amount of water it takes to yield in a C3 crop versus a C4 crop. So this is something that people are working on, are working towards, is the question, can we do this? This thing that's built in, that appears to be built in, this C3 mechanism that's built into photosynthesis, how a rice plant does photosynthesis, can we build that or breed that or genetically modify that thing into rice? That's the question. Because we could do a lot with that, right? We could do a lot more than we're currently doing in terms of production. Now we're going to turn to respiration. So that was a discussion of photosynthesis. And photosynthesis is the production of an energy compound. It's the capture of energy and the production of an energy compound that's transferable, that you can eat in grape nuts, if you like grape nuts, which is weird. But it's contained in a compound that you can consume, that livestock can consume, that humans can consume, and take that energy compound, that transportable energy. So when you go to the store and when you see a potato, that wonderful potato, you need to think about energy transport. And you're going to grab that energy module and you're going to slice it like they do at In-N-Out Burgers or Five Guys. You got to put it in some oil and cook it, and you're going to eat it. Five Guys is going to stuff your sack, brown sack, so full of fries, it's going to be so great. Okay? And you're going to consume it, and you're going to get energy out of that. But that getting energy process, that's called respiration. Respiration. Converting sugars formed from photosynthesis via this thing called ATP to energy for use in metabolism of living cells like mine. Respiration. You are respiring right now. Unbeknownst to you, you have been respiring since you were born. Okay? Since you were born. So you're respiring right now. Plants use this energy for cell maintenance. Again, important point, plants use energy. We almost always think, well, if I use energy, you got to heat up, right? Because we think when we work real hard, we're using energy and heat. Right? But that's not the case. That's not necessarily the case for other organisms like plants or friggin' snakes or whatever. They're cold-blooded, you know. Plants use this energy for cell maintenance, so they use energy too. Plants are respiring. They grow, they build new tissues, but it's super duper important for you to say, yes, plants are respiring, and if plants are respiring, guess what? See this equation? Hey, that looks familiar, doesn't it? Where'd that come from? Where did the plant get this? Photosynthesis. And it adds oxygen to it in a reaction that releases energy and CO2 and water. So when you're exercising or walking across campus and you're burning the energy that you took in this morning in whatever form you took it in, you have to breathe in order to burn. You have to breathe in oxygen in order to burn this carbohydrate. When you do that, when you breathe in oxygen and you break apart a carbohydrate, you get energy so that you can walk. And while you're walking, you breathe something out, carbon dioxide and water, right? So that's why you can go up to a mirror or a window and go, and what happens? It fogs up, right? Because you are respiring out water by means of this process. But the thing that you need to know, when we think about plants, when we think about especially plant roots that are due to take in oxygen. So when you have a flooded field and there's no oxygen available, just like you don't like to be flooded, I don't like to be flooded, the plant doesn't like to be flooded. Right? You've always heard, oh, plants take in CO2, so they don't need oxygen, just taking CO2. No, it's false. False. Okay? They take in oxygen as well. They need oxygen to burn this carbohydrate, so they have energy. So here's our comparison table for photosynthesis and respiration. Photosynthesis occurs in light, cool. Respiration occurs anytime. Photosynthesis produces sugars, awesome. Respiration uses sugars. Photosynthesis stores energy. It's an energy storage mechanism. Respiration is an energy release mechanism. Photosynthesis uses water, awesome, because respiration produces water. Photosynthesis uses CO2. Respiration produces CO2. It's like it's designed or something. Photosynthesis releases oxygen. Respiration uses oxygen. It's incredible. It's an incredible symbiotic relationship. And just in case it doesn't sort of make sense in that table, this is the same version, and we're going to add a little bit of complexity to it. Same version. So we have this photosynthesis where we have light, and you need to think about energy capture here. Right? So photosynthesis is this process of energy module creation. We're going to make the potato that's got energy in it, but that energy had to come from somewhere. It comes in the form of heat energy, light energy, that gets taken in photosynthesis. We're also going to add water to that. We're going to add carbon dioxide. When we capture that light energy, it kicks out sugars. Sugars can then be taken to form starches. Other things, pectin, cellulose. Remember our discussion of cellulosic material and cellulosic ethanol production. Okay. Here, with cellulose, we pointed to it when we looked at switchgrass. Right? Remember that big brown plant of switchgrass? And that's like almost 100% cellulose. That's cellulosic stuff there. Okay. So that cellulose material, can we use that for an energy source? There's energy locked away in it. We can't get to it. Cows can. Cows can. This is the magic thing about cows. I could eat grass all day long and I wouldn't gain a pound. Cows can eat grass all day long and they gain. Okay? They have the microbes to be able to do this process of breaking this down so that they can gain energy. If we add to that some of the minerals that we get from soils, we get a little more complexity. If we add to those sugars, minerals from soils, we get complex stuff that's totally awesome. Then we can take those sugars and we can respire them. When we respire them, we need to take in oxygen in that respiration process. We give off CO2, water, and we get an explosion of energy. So photosynthesis and respiration are symbiotic relationships. Sometimes they're happening within the plant. Sometimes the plant is just doing this process, photosynthesizing, storing stuff. It's going to use some of those photosynthetic processes as well. Sometimes it's going to form some of these materials so that it can do other things in the plants. So that it can put some other sorts of proteins at particular places in the plant, so that it can make that life, make that embryo inside the seed, so it can pass on the genetics. So sometimes you can just look at it enclosed in the plant, like this is just what a plant is doing when it's living. Other times we look at it as plants do this, and then we take this away from the plants, okay? And we reuse those products. All right, so that's photosynthesis and respiration. Hey, thanks for coming to class today. Don't forget to turn in your irrigation questions by 5 o'clock this evening if you want bonus points on your test.